The wind that came down from Pine Mountain in the winter of 1883 did not announce itself. It arrived between one breath and the next, a wall of cold air that dropped temperatures across Harlan County, Kentucky, to single digits before most families had finished stacking their second cord of firewood. Chimneys threw smoke sideways. Cabin walls contracted and groaned through the night. Children slept in their coats. It was not an unusual winter for the region. The Appalachian Highlands had always been unforgiving to anyone who misread their rhythms. But that particular season, something was different along the eastern edge of the valley. One cabin, smaller than most, sat unusually quiet. No frantic fire feeding after midnight. No frost on the inside of the window panes. No hollow look of exhaustion on the face of the man who stepped out each morning to check his woodpile. His neighbors noticed, and not with admiration, not at first. The most respected builder in the county had already made his position clear. Standing outside that cabin 2 months earlier, arms crossed, boots planted in the hard clay, he had said what most people in the valley were thinking. That thing he dug into the hillside is a gas trap and a fire waiting to happen. Mark my words, he won't see March. He was wrong. And the reasons why he was wrong tell us something important. Not just about one man's ingenuity, but about how heat actually moves through stone, earth, and air, and what happens when someone pays close enough attention to understand it. Today, you're going to follow the construction of one of the most unusual thermal systems ever built on the American frontier. You're going to understand exactly why it worked, in plain language with real numbers. And by the end, you'll see why the same builder who was called reckless became the most consulted man in the valley before the next winter arrived. If you're new here, subscribe right now. Every week, we bring you a real technique from the frontier, documented with precision, explained without shortcuts. These aren't myths. They're engineering, proven by the people who had no margin for error. Hit the bell so you don't miss a single one. Callum Reese arrived in Harlan County in the spring of 1881, part of the second wave of Welsh immigrants who had followed the coal seams west from Pennsylvania when the eastern mines began to thin out. He was 41 years old, compact, deliberate in movement, the kind of man who said little and observed everything. He had spent nearly 2 decades underground, first in the Rhondda Valley in Wales, then in the anthracite fields of Schuylkill County, and he understood the earth the way other men understood weather. Not as something to be fought, but as something to be read. He built his cabin on a narrow shelf of land where the valley wall angled upward toward an old iron ore prospect that had been abandoned sometime in the 1860s. The location was considered undesirable by most settlers. The ground was uneven, the access road rough, and the hillside behind it was riddled with shallow rock formations that made foundation work difficult. Callum chose it deliberately. The first winter, he lived the same way everyone else did. A single stone fireplace at the cabin center, green oak logs that hissed and spit, a cord and a half burned between November and February. The cabin stayed around 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius to 7 degrees Celsius, at floor level on the coldest nights, even with a strong fire burning. That was considered acceptable. That was the standard. But Callum had spent his working life in mine shafts, and he knew something that the carpenters and surface builders of the valley did not think about. The earth below the frost line is not cold. It is stable. At a depth of 50 to 60 feet, 15 to 18 meters, the ground in eastern Kentucky maintains a temperature of roughly 52 degrees Fahrenheit to 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius to 13 degrees Celsius, year-round, warmer than a frozen cabin floor in January, cooler than a summer afternoon in August. The earth at depth is a thermal battery. It stores the average annual temperature of the region and holds it with almost no variation, regardless of what the air above is doing. The abandoned prospect shaft 80 feet, 24 meters, behind his cabin registered, by Callum's own measurement using a mercury thermometer, a consistent 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius, at a depth of approximately 55 feet, 17 meters. That number stayed with him through the second winter as he watched his neighbors burn through their wood piles at a pace that seemed, to him, unnecessary. The question was not whether the warmth was there. The question was how to move it. In the spring of 1883, Callum began construction on what he called, in the brief accounts preserved by the county land office, simply the passage. It was, in precise terms, a covered thermal gallery, a below-grade stone corridor, 22 feet, 6.7 meters, long and 28 inches, 71 centimeters, wide, built from locally quarried limestone, connecting the crawl space beneath his cabin floor to the entrance of the abandoned mine shaft. The principle behind it was straightforward, even if the construction was not. Cold air is dense and heavy. It sinks and infiltrates structures at the floor level, which is why the coldest part of any frontier cabin was always the floor and the first 18 inches, 46 centimeters, of air above it. Callum's design addressed this directly by replacing that ground-level cold air infiltration with a controlled supply of geothermal air from the mine. Air that entered the gallery at approximately 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius, and traveled through 22 feet of limestone passage before entering the cabin's subfloor space. The limestone was a key component, and Callum selected it carefully. Limestone has a specific heat capacity that allows it to absorb and slowly release thermal energy, meaning the walls of the gallery themselves became a buffer. During the hours when the cabin's small iron stove was burning, some of that radiant heat conducted downward to the floor and into the limestone of the gallery walls, warming them. During the night, when the fire was reduced or extinguished, those same walls released that stored heat back into the air, moving through the passage. The gallery did not just transport air, it conditioned it. At the cabin end of the gallery, Callum installed a timber frame vent register in the floor, fitted with a sliding stone tile that could be opened or closed from inside. This gave him direct control over airflow. At the mine end, he built what oral accounts from the valley describe as a double-door vestibule, 2 stone and timber barriers spaced 18 inches, 46 centimeters, apart, functioning like an airlock. This was the detail that most irritated the builders who came to inspect his work. To them, it looked overbuilt, fussy, expensive in labor. To Callum, it was non-negotiable. A single barrier would allow warm cabin air to escape directly into the mine, reversing the airflow. The double vestibule eliminated that problem by creating a pressure buffer, air moving in one direction at a time, no thermal short circuit. He also addressed concern about mine gases directly. The prospect shaft in question had not been a coal mine. It was a shallow iron ore drift, roughly 35 feet, 10.7 meters deep, that had been abandoned when the ore grade proved insufficient for commercial extraction. Iron ore drifts of this type do not accumulate methane the way coal seams do. The primary gas risk in a shallow iron prospect was carbon dioxide pooling in low areas, a real hazard, but one that Callum understood and managed by ensuring the gallery floor sloped slightly downward from the cabin toward the mine, encouraging any denser gases to stay at the mine end rather than migrate toward the living space. He tested the airflow by placing a candle flame at the register opening each morning before opening it fully. None of this was explained to the neighbors who walked up the hill to look at the half-finished stonework. What they saw was a man digging a tunnel into a hillside and calling it a heating system. What the builders saw was liability dressed up as innovation. The man who led the opposition was named Silas Drummond. He was 53 years old in 1883, had been building in Harlan County for more than 20 years, and was regarded as the most experienced carpenter and mason in the eastern end of the valley. He had built the county clerk's office, the Methodist Church addition, and more than 30 cabins across the region. When Silas Drummond said a structure was wrong, people listened. He said this one was wrong. He came up the hill in late September, as the passage walls were nearing completion, and stood at the entrance of the gallery for several minutes without speaking. Then he walked the perimeter of the construction, tapped at the limestone mortaring with his knuckle, and turned to the 2 younger men who had come with him. "That arch over the entrance will settle before Christmas," he said, loud enough for Callum to hear. "Limestone laid dry like that doesn't hold in freeze-thaw. First hard frost, it heaves, then it cracks, then it lets in every draft from that hillside instead of keeping it out." It was a reasonable structural concern, and not entirely without basis. Dry-laid limestone in a shallow cut can be vulnerable to frost heave if the drainage is poor. What Drummond did not see or did not acknowledge was that Callum had graded the exterior of the passage with a 4-inch, 10 centimeters. Packed clay caps sloped away from the hillside, specifically to divert surface water and reduce the frost penetration into the masonry. The drainage detail was invisible from the outside. The structural concern was visible. So the structural concern was what got repeated. By the time October arrived, the commentary in the valley had expanded beyond engineering. A timber supplier named Harker, who had sold Callum his framing lumber that spring and clearly resented that Callum seemed to be deliberately reducing his future with purchases, was more pointed in his assessment. A man who hides behind a mine shaft to stay warm isn't really staying warm, Harker reportedly said at the feed store one afternoon. He's just afraid of winter. The capataz, the shift foreman, at the active mine 2 miles up the road, sent word through a mutual acquaintance that Callum was, in his words, playing with the ground in a way that doesn't end well for anyone nearby. The concern was vague, but the tone was official sounding, and it carried weight. Callum's response to all of it was to finish the gallery, install the floor register, seal the vestibule, and stack his woodpile, which that autumn was noticeably smaller than in previous years. His neighbors assumed he simply hadn't cut enough yet. He had cut exactly as much as he calculated he would need. The cold front that reached Harlan County on the 8th of January, 1884, arrived with unusual speed and unusual depth. Within 36 hours, temperatures dropped from a manageable 28 degrees Fahrenheit minus 2 degrees Celsius to a sustained minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit minus 28 degrees Celsius, a swing of 46 degrees Fahrenheit in a day and a half. The wind came from the northwest, straight down the valley, and it did not relent for 11 consecutive days. The firewood situation turned serious by the 4th day. Much of the wood that families had stacked outdoors had been harvested late in the season and hadn't fully seasoned. Green or partially seasoned wood burns poorly in extreme cold. It takes more energy to drive out the moisture than it releases as heat, and in temperatures below minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 23 degrees Celsius, a fire fed with wet wood can barely overcome its own inefficiency. Families began supplementing with fence rails, old furniture, anything combustible. The general store sold out of lamp oil in 2 days. Chimneys became a separate problem. Clay mortared chimneys common to the region contracted in the extreme cold, opening small cracks where they had previously been tight. Cold air poured around the firebox seams. Draft reversed intermittently, sending smoke back into cabins instead of drawing it out. On at least 3 homesteads within a mile of the valley center, families had to abandon their fires entirely for hours at a time because the smoke became unbreathable. Callum Reese fed his stove twice that first night, once at dusk, once just before midnight. Then he slept. His neighbors, taking note of thin smoke rising from his chimney at intervals that seemed impossible given the conditions outside, began to pay a different kind of attention. If you've stayed with this story this far, don't leave now, because what happened over the next week produced a number that not one builder in that valley could explain away. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, because the people who understand this kind of cold are spread across every mountain range and northern plain on the map. We want to hear from you. On the 14th of January, 1884, the 6th day of the polar event, a neighbor named Thomas Eckert walked up the hill to Callum's cabin. Eckert was a former schoolteacher who kept a journal and owned, notably, 2 mercury thermometers, one of which he carried with him that morning. What he measured and what he recorded in his journal, a transcription of which is held in the Harlan County Historical Society collection, was as follows. The interior temperature of Callum's single-room cabin, taken at floor level near the center of the room, was 53 degrees Fahrenheit, 11.7 degrees Celsius. The stove had not been fed since approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, roughly 6 hours prior to the measurement. Outside, the temperature was minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 25.6 degrees Celsius. That is a differential of 67 degrees Fahrenheit between the inside of the cabin and the outside air, without an active fire. For comparison, Eckert recorded the temperature inside his own cabin on the same morning, 31 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 0.6 degrees Celsius, with a fire burning. His cabin had a conventional central fireplace with a clay chimney. He had burned through his main wood pile and was supplementing with split fence rails. The mechanism behind Callum's numbers was exactly what he had designed it to be, with the floor register open, geothermal air from the mine, steady at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius, circulated to the gallery and entered the subfloor space, providing a continuous baseline of warmth at ground level. The limestone walls of the gallery, having absorbed heat from the stove during the previous evening's fire, were releasing that stored energy slowly into the airstream passing over them. The cabin's log walls, 9 inches, 23 centimeters of dense hardwood, provided the outer envelope. Together, the system maintained livable temperatures with what amounted to minimal active heating. Over the full 11 days of the cold event, Callum consumed an estimated 2.4 cords of wood, calculated from the dimensions of his remaining stack after the event, as noted by Eckert in the same journal. The valley average, based on accounts from several households, was between 4.5 and 6 cords for the same period. Families with larger cabins or poorly sealed chimneys reported consuming more. Callum used roughly 40 to 45% less fuel than his closest neighbors, and maintained a warmer interior temperature doing it. The gallery had not collapsed. The limestone had not heaved. The mine gases had not entered the cabin. Every structural objection raised in the autumn had, in the cold logic of an 11-day polar event, been quietly answered. Silas Drummond came up the hill on the 19th of January, for days after the polar event broke. He came alone in the early afternoon, and he did not knock. He stood at the entrance to the gallery for a long time, long enough that Callum, watching from the cabin window, decided to put on his coat and come outside. According to Eckert's journal, which records a conversation he had with Callum the following week, Drummond said almost nothing during that visit. He walked the length of the gallery exterior, crouched at the vestibule entrance, looked at the drainage grade, examined the mortar lines. He stood at the floor register from inside the cabin and held his hand over the opening for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he said, "The arch held." That was all. It was not an apology. It was not an endorsement. But from Silas Drummond, it was the closest thing to either that anyone in the valley had ever heard. The following autumn, the winter of 1884 to 85, 3 households in the valley broke ground on variations of Callum's passage system. None of them had a mine shaft available, but 2 families had existing root cellars cut into hillsides, and they extended those cellars with short limestone corridors connecting to their cabin crawl spaces, applying the same principle. Use a stable subterranean temperature as a thermal baseline. Let the stone gallery condition the incoming air. Control the flow with a floor register. The 3rd family, working with Drummond himself, who said nothing publicly about the origin of the design, dug a 14-foot, 4.3-meter pit adjacent to their cabin and lined it with sandstone, capping it with a timber frame packed with clay. It was a simplified version of the gallery, essentially a thermal buffer chamber rather than a true corridor. It worked less efficiently than Callum's system, but it meaningfully reduced their consumption over the following winter by what Eckert estimated as 20 to 25%. By the winter of 1886 to 87, oral accounts from the region indicate that at least 14 structures in the broader valley had incorporated some version of subterranean air tempering, passages, pit chambers, extended root cellars, or below-grade stone vestibules. The terminology varied. The principle did not. No one called it a gas trap anymore. No one said it was cowardice against the cold. The valley had tested the idea under the most demanding conditions imaginable, and the idea had answered. What had changed was not the physics. The physics had always been there, waiting in the 54-degree stillness of the earth below the frost line. What changed was that enough people had seen the numbers to stop arguing with them. Callum Reese did not patent his design. He did not write a manual. He did not give his system a name or seek recognition from the engineering societies that were, by the 1880s, beginning to formalize the principles of building science in American construction. He did something simpler. He paid attention to what the earth was already doing, and he built a structure that worked with it instead of against it. The physics behind his gallery are not mysterious. Geothermal stability, the principle that ground temperature below the frost line reflects the long-term average air temperature of the region, not its seasonal extremes, was understood by scientists long before Callum Reese was born. What Callum understood from years underground was how to use that stability at a practical scale, with locally available materials, without machinery, without fuel, without anything except limestone, labor, and careful observation. The limestone gallery he built is, in fundamental terms, the same system that modern geothermal heat exchangers use today. Pipes buried below the frost line, circulating fluid that picks up stable earth temperature and transfers it to a building's interior. The difference is that Callum's version was built in 1883 with hand tools and cost him roughly 40 days of his own labor. The modern version requires a licensed contractor, an electric pump, and a refrigerant circuit. The physics are identical. This is what the Frontier built, over and over, in different materials and different climates. Solutions that look primitive from the outside and reveal themselves, under examination, to be precise responses to specific physical problems. The Appalachian miners who understood the Earth's thermal behavior, the sod house builders on the Great Plains who used the ground itself as insulation, the Russian stove designers who turned masonry into a slow-release heat battery. None of them had degrees in thermodynamics. All of them understood, from practice and observation, what thermodynamics actually does. Callum's cabin stood until at least 1901, when it appears in a county property record under a different owner's name. The gallery was noted in that record as a structural feature of the property, described simply as stone passage to hillside, serviceable. 20 years after it was called a gas trap and a disaster waiting to happen, it had become a feature worth listing. That is how good ideas travel on the frontier, not through announcements, through winters. If this story gave you something, a number, an idea, a detail you'll carry with you, leave it a like and subscribe. This channel is built for people who take this history seriously, and every week we go deeper. Real techniques, real materials, real measurements from the people who built shelters that had to work or else. Now tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever had to survive? Someone down there has a story that belongs in this series. It might be yours.